What a treat today. I'm so pleased to introduce my guest, harpsichordist, improviser, and conductor, Dr. Ewald Demeyere. Professor Demeyere studied at the Royal Conservatoire of Antwerp, obtaining his master's degree for harpsichord in Jos van Immerseel's class. On completion of his studies in 1997, he was engaged as a teacher of harmony, counterpoint, and fugue by the Royal Conservatoire of Antwerp. In 2002, he succeeded Jos van Immerseel as professor of harpsichord, and he is also a professor at IMEP in Belgium. A specialist in early music, Partimento, and counterpoint, he was the winner of the CPE Bach Counterpoint Contest. As a recording artist, he has recorded many albums, including Tears, harpsichord laments of the 17th century, 18th century Flemish harpsichord music, Telemann Les Nations, overture and oboe concertos, Mozart's Grand Partita, and many more. Ewald, it's such an honor to have you on the show today.
Thank you so much for that wonderful introduction.
Let's start at the beginning. How old were you when you started music?
I guess music has always been a part of my life. My parents are both amateur musicians, so classical music, or I should say rather music in general, was always present in our house. And actually my mom played already the harpsichord when I was very, very, very young. So there was an instrument at home, and my parents were good friends to a quite well-known organist in Belgium, Roger de Ruwe, who was the main organist of the Cathedral of Bruges. And they were singing in more than one of his choirs. And they asked him what keyboard instrument would be best suited for me. And he said, obviously harpsichord, because it offers the most possibilities of playing together, playing alone, playing chamber music, orchestral things, etc.
Did you start piano lessons or harpsichord lessons really young?
I was actually, if I remember well, I was the first person being able to start with harpsichord, not being obliged to start with piano at the music academy. So I started immediately with harpsichord, but my teacher, Karin Verheineman, found it also important that during the road, so to speak, I also did some piano. So she also taught me the piano. And I've always been playing the piano, so I never stopped playing piano, but I don't consider myself a pianist, so I'm modest.
Do you have absolute or perfect pitch?
Yes, but I don't find that so interesting. I often find that rather a burden than a help. What I find what I find absolutely paramount for a musician, especially for a keyboard player who wants to improvise, is a harmonic ear. Because if you have perfect pitch, the problem is that when switching instruments or when switching pitch, so for instance, when I play, I would say Bach on a keyboard, I would play at 415 hertz. When I play, let's say, French music like Couperin, François Couperin, then I go half a tone even lower. When I play Mozart, I go even above 415. So that's, for someone who has perfect pitch, that's quite a challenge to adapt.
Does it bother you when you have to play in these different frequencies?
Let's say that now I'm used to it, but in the beginning it was quite a test. And I remember well one of the first productions I did with La Petite Bande in the 90s. It was a French program, so with Rameau, Rebel, etc. And I remember that Rio Terracado, who was the concertmaster at that time, he came to me to tune his violin. And he came with a note, which for me was a G. And I was thinking, that's so strange. Why does he come with a G? And I was playing on my keyboard, and actually, of course, he was playing an A. But, I mean, it's a full tone lower than moderate pitch. And I remember that well, and I thought, I have to do something about that, because I have to adapt myself, because it cannot be a burden. I just have to let it go and really be in the pitch and listen more and more, if that is even possible, more and more harmonically than just listen to the absolute pitch of the notes.
Can I ask you a question? Did you improvise as a child?
I guess I've always been improvising right from the start. My teacher at the academy had, let's say, the brilliant idea of having me play basso continuo right from the start. I remember well that I started, with playing small harpsichord pieces, and then very, very, very early on, she gave me a basso continuo. I remember it was a cello sonata, and even in facsimile, right on from the very first moment, it's like being thrown into, how does one say that in English? Thrown into the depth of...
the deep end of the pool, yeah.
Deep of the pool, exactly. And I remember that well, and she just explained me a couple of basic things, that a 5 means this, a 6 means this, and then she sent me home, and I got inspired by that, and that really... I felt something special about it because it stimulated my brain and it stimulated my creativity. And I guess that was really the start of, let's say, an approach to music which is not at all reproductive, but which is creative, and which is something which I try to do with everything I do. Not just reproducing the notes, but I mean, the notation is not the music, to quote Barthold Keuken. So that has been right from the start very important. And she also encouraged me to compose. So during my young life, let's say my education in the music school consisted of 3 somewhat parallel and overlapping domains. So there was the solo repertoire, there was the basso continuo repertoire, and there was the composing repertoire. And during concerts and during class concerts, etc., and exams, I could even perform my own pieces. So she was very important for me, just in stimulating my musical mind, I would say.
How was the culture around your improvisation at the time? Were people encouraging, enthusiastic? Obviously your teacher was, but isn't it the case that in classical music improvisation is quite rare?
It is. It was completely rare, and I think I was the exception, let's say. I mean, I have to say another thing, because I already spoke about that organist, Roger de Rubbe, who was also a brilliant improviser. And as you know, the organists are perhaps, or that's restarting perhaps now. But anyway, the organists were, let's say, the last species, so to say, to maintain, to keep improvisation as a core business within their daily life. So that organist always encouraged me, because I mean he was a good friend. He still is a good friend. He's well into his 90s, but he's still among us, thankfully. He encouraged me always very, very strongly to know harmony, to know counterpoint, to know fugue, to improvise, and really to get loose from the written notes. And so I had main influences in that time, already to make this path towards 18th century thinking, because at that time, obviously, Partimento was not quite yet, was not discovered. I didn't discover it yet. So the models were perhaps somewhat different, or perhaps somewhat less organized than they are today. But there was a definite stimulation with being creative and being active at the keyboard.
So you are well known as really a specialist and expert in Partimento. Before you sort of discovered Partimento and music schema, was your approach kind of, you mentioned basso continuo, general bass, and you won the CPE contest, the award. Did you read his book, his treatise and improvisation in a different way from Partimento before that?
Exactly. Actually, when you read CPE, when you read the treatise, you have to read it, I wanted to say a couple of times, but even you have to read it 7, 8, 9, 10 times, because it's so dense, it's so complicated, and you always see different things, and it's really hard to get to the bottom of it. But it's so rich, it's so profound, and I guess that also is a difficulty, especially when you read the second volume, which is dedicated to basso continuo and, let's be honest, very modestly to improvisation. I mean, if you want to learn to improvise from Carl Philipp Emanuel, you will not succeed, because it's not a method. He gives a tremendous amount of information, but it's very, very, very difficult to assimilate all that information. I mean, the core business of his treatise is explaining how the figures work. And he gives a huge amount of them. And he gives very, 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 very detailed information on how to realize those figures. And you have to know that his era is, in his time, one played continuo in a completely different way than compared with the era of Johann Sebastian Bach. There is a real style break, one could say.
So you won the counterpoint contest. How did you study counterpoint? What was your approach before Partimento?
It was very instinct-like, I would say. I followed, I guess, the path that a lot of my colleagues followed. On the one hand, you have the severe counterpoint, à la Fuchs, which has hardly anything to do with music, if I dare to say. Let's shock some people.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, and then obviously, when one thinks of 18th century music and 18th century counterpoint, you cannot deny Johann Sebastian Bach. But the problem with Johann Sebastian Bach is that he is on such a high level, on such an exceptional level, that he's not a very good model for a student, because his writing is so exceptionally exceptional that it's so overwhelming to when as a student or even as a teacher, when you try to make his writing into, I would say, into a method or into rules by which you can organize a standard and by which you can make students work. So what I tried is to go to what they call today lesser, kleinere maestri, so smaller maestri, and then from those compositions, it's often easier to show students how counterpoint can work in 18th century language.
Now, can you describe how you came to Partimento?
That's very easy. I saw a flyer in Belgium, I think it was 2002 or 2003, I don't remember the right year anymore, by a certain Giorgio Sanguinetti, you obviously know. And he came to Ghent, and he gave a lecture, a 2-day lecture, if I remember well, on Partimento. And then there was a little text explaining that this was the method by which all the great composers in the 18th century learned their craft from a very early age. And as you know, a craft which is absolutely stunning. If you look at all the great 18th century Italian Neapolitan composers who wrote such a great amount of great music, that immediately stimulated me to attend that seminar by Professor Sanguinetti. And at the same time, I immediately felt this is something which I need not only for myself to improve my insights into 18th century music, improvisation, understanding the way of composing, but obviously also for me as a teacher, because I've always been intrigued by the fact that one should not put walls in. Intrigued is the wrong word. I've always been convinced, that I wanted to say. I've been always convinced about the fact that one should not put walls in between what has been separated since the 19th century. You have, at the one hand, you have the instrumental course. At the other hand, you have the harmony course. At the other hand, you have the practical harmony course. You have counterpoint. No, I really wanted to teach music, and I'm doing that more than ever. I think my students can can confirm that. When I'm teaching harpsichord today, I'm speaking about harmony, I'm speaking about partimento, I'm speaking about performance practice, I'm speaking about improvisation. There should not be, those courses should not be individual courses. There should be, this is one course.
That's a good 10 years at least before he released his monograph, The Art of Partimento. And so how did you begin to get into it? What things did you work on?
Right from the start, I could find some material. Actually, Professor Sanguinetti gave us a very nice, I should say, a synopsis of the rules. I mean, he gave a little package of partimenti, and I started to study them. And then I remember that fairly quickly I came across Robert Gjerdingen, and then obviously I saw the huge potential of what Robert Gjerdingen gave, so to speak. If you compare what Mr. Sanguinetti does and what Mr. Gjerdingen does, they actually look at the same thing but with different glasses. Professor Sanguinetti looks at 18th century music, how to arrive at improvisation, at composition, really from the method, really from Partimento, really from how Partimento was taught within the Neapolitan school. And then what Mr. Gjerdingen does is that he obviously did the same thing, because in his book there is an addendum dedicated to Partimento. But he starts rather from compositions, from comparing compositions and from analyzing them from schematic point of view. What is similar between a minuet of Mozart and a minuet of Boccherini, so to speak? How did those composers build up their compositions? And there you see that at least the idea of Partimento with it, the schematic thinking, so you have one phrase which is followed by another phrase, which is logically followed by another phrase, is actually the basis, so to speak, of, in between brackets, every 18th century composer. When you approach it from Partimento, or when you approach it from the schematic point of view, eventually you will arrive at the same result. Because you cannot state that Mozart, for instance, who is perhaps the most, if one dare say, the ideal gallant composer, he did not arrive at his result through Partimento education, but he did arrive at the result through his schematic education via his father. So you see that the same result is achieved somehow by somewhat different methods, so to speak.
You're known for being a real expert on Fenaroli, and so did you begin to tackle his partimenti exercises and look at his materials?
What I find so stimulating with the partimenti of Fenaroli, indeed, he's one of my friends. I can say even in the meantime. What I find so amazing, there are two things for me which are so amazing. At the one hand, his method is arguably the best, in a sense that I've been studying so many manuscripts of his partimenti, and they show actually very similar contents. There is a small evolution within the Partimento corpus of Fenaroli. At the beginning of his career, there were lesser Partimento in his full corpus than later on. And at the very end of his life, he decided to write even a full-blown new book with complex partimenti. But aside from that, what you see is a constant concern for gradual increase of complexity. So the method is so beautiful. He starts easily in his first book with the main rules, so to speak. I won't get technical now.
Oh, you can, please.
So he just, that's fantastic. So he just starts with cadences. That's a fairly easy thing to conceive. And then in the same book, he obviously wants also the rule of the octave to be known. The rule of the octave, which was a tool for the student to know which chord to play on every note of the scale. I mean, in the left hand, when the bass moves stepwise. So when you have do re di do di da, on each note, the student had to learn which chord to play. This is basically the material for the first book. He must have introduced already modulation, because right from the start, from his very first Partimento, you see that he wants his students already to get acquainted with a real musical situation. It starts in G major. After a couple of bars, he goes to D major, and then he comes back to G major. And exactly that is for me one of the things which touches me so much, because he's, as perhaps every Partimento teacher, he is so concerned with an actual musical situation. He does not want to instruct students into music theory. He wants to instruct pupils into music practice. And you see right from the start that his partimenti are very small but real musical compositions. And gradually the partimenti get bigger and bigger. And there I have to make the link to the research and the work of Mr. Gjerdingen. You see that the schemas that are discussed within Mr. Gjerdingen's famous book on the gallant style all appear within the partimenti of Fenaroli, and exactly at the places where they should occur. Because this is absolutely astonishing observation what Robert Gjerdingen has achieved. One of the things which is so fascinating about his work is that not only he identified so many schemas, but what is even more important for me is that a certain schema has a certain place by preference in a certain composition. And this means that when you look at the partimenti of Fenaroli, those specific, in Italian we call them moti del basso, will occur at specific places within the partimento. This does not mean that they cannot occur in other places, obviously, but the student had to learn his craft. And so, for instance, when a piece is in G major, you get the logical modulation to D major, towards the middle of the piece, after which Fenaroli very, very often, but really very often, introduces a fonte, because that was the place to put a fonte. And so you really see the concern of Fenaroli right from the start to train his students to become a professional musician, to learn music, not to learn about music. And this is for me, this is so amazing and so important that when I teach myself, that I can make the connection with living music. That when I have a piano student who, let's be honest about it, the piano student often has focus on the pianism, has a focus on playing his 6, 7, 8 hours a day. And if I can show them that when they play a Mozart sonata, that they should play the repeats, that the repeat is not there to annoy them or to be left out. What they do mostly, they leave out the repeat because they don't know often they are annoyed with it or they don't know what to do with it. But if you know the language from within, in the repeat you can change things. You could change even a complete moto del basso. You could change the decoratio. You could add some ornaments, etc., etc., etc.
You mentioned modulation in Fenaroli right from the earliest Partimenti, but I was curious, he doesn't really discuss mutation, right, in his rules. I think you can find that in Furno, but you can't find that in Fenaroli's rules. So are there some things that are missing, so to speak, within his rules?
There are a lot of things missing in his rules. His rules are really, I would say, rudimentary, and he even, I can't remember, I think it's in his preface or right at the end of his regole that he says that if one finds mistakes or if one feels the necessity of adding rules, please do. So you see, it's really it's a starting point. It's really rudimentary, and it also shows the huge importance of the one-to-one contact. It shows the relation, so to speak, of mentor and disciple. That they had this. I mean, in Neapolitan education, there was this oral tradition. You had the teacher, you had the student, and they had a lot of lesson, very intense relationship. And of course, when you have on a fairly daily basis lesson, there is no need to notate so much. Hence the difficulty for us to understand this training, what this training really consisted of. Hence also the fact that it took so long, in fact, it's one of the reasons that it took so long to discover this training. I mean, if I look at, I've studied the counterpoint courses of several of Fenaroli students. So there is a beautiful manuscript, I mean, there are more of them, by a certain Biagio Muscogiuri, who followed counterpoint in the 80s, amongst others. I mean, with Fenaroli, but also with an assistant of Fenaroli. And there I've made a study of trying to find the rules just from analyzing, from playing all the counterpoint exercises. And one of the things which struck me was the amount of things Fenaroli had to add during the courses to be able at arriving at such an incredibly high level of counterpoint, of the quality of the counterpoint, the quality of composition, if one can say, is astonishingly high. There is a second counterpoint course which I studied, which is a little more known than Muscogiuri. This is the counterpoint course by Lavinia, which is the beginning of the 90s, first half of the 90s.
You're talking about 1790s, right? Not the 1990s.
1790s, yes. Yeah,
not talking about the Backstreet Boys here, right?
Yeah. not quite, I would say. And there you see the amount of exercises they had to write is absolutely astonishing. Hundreds and hundreds of pages of high quality of composition counterpoint / composition. And this explains why those composers had such a craft. And this is one of the things I try to explain students now, that if they want to achieve a high level in whatever area, they have to invest in themselves.
Okay, this is perfect. This leads me right into how we can get into this, getting to a high level of partimenti realization. Now, you've really been looking at this at a long time. You mentioned earlier that CPE box treatise is very difficult to get you to improvise. Clearly, Fenaroli is much easier. Progressively, it allows you to start to do this, but some things are missing. So let's say you had a kid, and you've already mentioned, learn the cadences, learn the rule of the octave in the first book, learn scale mutations. Now, how would you craft for a new young musician, someone who's fresh to this, how would you craft a plan for them to get to a high level of realization for partimenti?
That's an excellent question. And one of the things which, if I stick to Fenaroli, which is the method I know best, let's say, when I look at his concern, is that in the beginning he starts with full-voiced sonorities, so to speak. So he wants his students to learn the rule of the octave first, not the cadences. That's also an interesting fact. Anyhow, it's like this. And he let them play the rule of the octave with full chords. And
Is that 3 voices in the right hand?
even more. I would say even almost 10 digits on the keyboard.
Wow.
Really big chords. And there is not a concern in the beginning for voice leading. So you get parallels, no problem. But they get acquainted to, I would say, to the sonorities on each scale step of the scale. And then they can go to the Partimento playing and play it in a very rudimentary way, in a sense that when you have a half note, imagine that we are in 4/4, you have 2 half notes in first bar, followed by 4 quarter notes in the second bar. Instead of already trying to make it musically interesting, the first step to do is that Partimento player is that he plays the full chords, that he understands that a certain bass note implies a certain sonority. And depending on the level of the student, this takes more or less time. So this depends.
So wait a second. As an example, so let's take number 1, book 1. So how would you want somebody to start with that one? You're saying full sonority, as many voices as you can?
Absolutely. So this means that basically when you look at the first bars, you see that there are only quarter notes. So this means you will play every correct sonority on each bass note. Then when you come into, bar 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, in bar 6, Fenaroli stops his quarter note movement and he switches into half note movement. The first step there is to really respect the basic sonorities. So when you have that C sharp, just play the 6/5 chord. When you have the D, just play the D major chord. When you have the A in the next bar, just play the A major chord. This is the first step. But obviously, and this is one of the things which is so important also within the Partimento tradition, this is that harmonic rhythm right from the start is introduced within the method. Look at the cadences. The cadences teach that when the bass note takes 1 beat within the bar, you play cadenza semplice, 1 chord. However, when the bass note takes 2 beats within the bar, instead of making let's say, musically uninteresting solution by changing position in the right hand, the Partimento student is immediately introduced to a thing which they see much later, which will be made explicit much later, but from the start, which is already in their repertoire, namely a suspension. So they will play a cadenza composta, and they already get this musically real situation with a suspension right from the start. And this you see in the first Partimento by Fenaroli, you see exactly the same thing. Fenaroli gives a C sharp lasting half a bar, so lasting 2 beats. It's the task of the student, when he knows first that he has to play a 6/5 chord, it's his task to come up with a musical solution to make those 2 beats interesting. One interesting solution to that problem is, instead of playing that beautiful sonority of 6/5 vertically, he can play that beautiful sonority horizontally. So instead of playing the A, G together vertically, he can first play a 6 chord and then having the diminished fifth as a horizontal melodical note following the A to arrive on the F sharp in the middle of the bar. One could even go one step further and making that logic, applying that logic also to the middle of that bar. Because there we have the problem that we have two beats of D. How can we make that second half of that bar more interesting, giving a musical solution to it? Obviously, it's by introducing a dissonance, introducing a suspension. which they already knew thanks to the cadenza composta. So in this case, the soprano could be la ram ti ram. So postponing the F sharp until the fourth beat, replacing it with 4 on the middle of that bar. This is a gradual process, and with Fenaroli, I find it so stimulating that he anticipates regole, which are dealt with, I would say, more elaborately later within the course.
I have a question now. How about the minor? The rules are similar, but what about if you're having to deal with the raised 6 and 7 and the natural 6 and 7 in the minor mode? How do you get over that confusion?
There are two things which seem contradictory, which a student has to get. There is obviously, at the one hand, melodical idea in the bass, because the rule of the octave suggests a solution to give a chord on every successive scale step of any scale. So this means if I want to go from, let's keep G, because we just had this Partimento in G major, let's go to G minor. So this means when I go from D and I want to go up by step, the only possibility of avoiding that I'm obliged to go down when I go from D to E flat, when I sing Re, Mi, I'm obliged to go back to Re. However, when I want to go up, I'm obliged to raise that E flat to E natural. Because I give this E natural obliges me to go on to the F sharp. That F sharp, which obliges me to go on to the G. So first, it's very important that the student understands this melodical aspect of the scale. And the other way around, of course, it's similar. When you go down from the high G and you want to go to the D, from the moment that you play F sharp, you are in trouble. Because if you play F sharp, you are obliged to go. You can still descend chromatically, but that is too early in the method. Normally, when you play F sharp, you go back up to the G. So when he wants to go down, he has to lower the F sharp into F natural. He has to lower he has to not lower, but really respect the normal sixth scale step. So this is the E flat, going to the D. So this is a melodical aspect. Going up, you have to raise 6 and 7. Going down, they appear in their lowered guise. And
it feels completely natural after you do it for a while.
It feels completely natural because it's a note with an obligation, with a directional obligation, if that is English. Because we have do, ra, di, do, re, di, ra, da. From the moment I sing do, 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 da, one, you immediately hear one, you immediately hear one. And then when I go down, you have one, 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 one. When I want to go down and I sing down, voilà, I'm in trouble because this F sharp in 95% of cases really implies one to go up again. So this is the first thing that the student has to understand. And then obviously there is the harmonical aspect. And if you read Fenaroli, this is a bit funny even, I would say, is that going up, no problem. The explanation is clear, but going down, you see that there is a kind of a tension within what the left hand does and what the right hand does. Because what the left hand does really, I would say, respects the scale of G minor, while the right hand wants to touch upon D minor, major, it's still G minor. So it gets a little bit confusing, which obviously is the wonderful augmented sixth chord. So you have the E flat in the bass, you have the C sharp combined with the A and the G, which gives this amazing sonority, which for them was normal sonority, but which keeps on for me being really Amazing. So this tension between the melodical element, and this is such a basic thing of Partimento thinking in scale steps, the one hand, and then putting the right chord, the right sonority in the right hand. This is what makes this method so fascinating and so direct and so excellent, because there is no mental break in between theory and practice. If I say to you, can you play for me a third inversion of a dominant 7 chord in E flat major, when we need a little moment of, okay, that's the one. There is some mental activity which slows down somewhat the process. And they were not trained in that way. They were trained in seeing the bass, A flat, and knowing when it goes down, there is a 6/4-2 chord or a 4/2 chord on it. So it's the atrem, the immediate reaction, which I find so great in the complete method, actually.
Talking about the dissonances, the 2nd, the 4, the 7, the 9, what's a good way to really get that good into your playing?
You have to make a distinction between the dissonances in the right hand and the dissonances in the left hand. Let's start with the dissonances in the left hand. Fenaroli, he's not the only one, but he gives a very interesting explanation. I will start with the first suspension in the bass, which they learned. Imagine that you are in C major and you introduce a C on a weak beat. And then that C is tied over towards the strong beat. So there the Partimento player already knows, this will be, or this becomes a dissonant note. That C in the bass on the strong beat is a dissonant note. Then afterwards, that C will descend to B. The Partimento student has to look then to the next note to know what chord to play on the moment of dissonance. Because Fenaroli explains, when you have, I will sing it, will be clear, C, B, C. When you have this, Fenaroli explains that the moment of dissonance has to be accompanied with 4/2. And actually he says with the minor fourth, which we in modern terms would call the pure fourth. That's the first thing. However, when the bass line continues to descend after the B instead of going back to the C, so C, B, A, G. When you have this line, Fenaroli says that the moment of dissonance does not require the minor fourth, but the major fourth, which we would call the augmented fourth. So this implies actually a scale mutation, because we leave the scale of C and we go into the scale of G major. So that's a huge one. That's a very, very important one. And actually, you know this piece. The first prelude of Johann Sebastian Bach does exactly this. Of Wohltemperierte Klavier is exactly this this illustration, I would say, of the 4/2 chords on the first scale step. So there are other ones, but let's just I want to stick just with that in the bass. Obviously, this is easy. This is not negotiable, I would say, because this is the rule. This is the regole. When you have a weak beat note and it is prolonged until a strong beat, it requires dissonance. Voilà. That's a basic thing.
You mentioned the left hand in the bass. What about the right hand in the dissonances?
When you have a consonant chord, so this means basically a 5th chord or a 6th chord, and those chords, or that chord, takes longer than one beat in the bar. Now I'm giving very elementary rules, but if that basic consonant chord takes more than one beat, the reaction of the Partimento player would be, or should be, I cannot just plainly play that normal chord. because this would musically not be so interesting. What is the first reaction he will have? I will add a dissonance to it. So this means that imagine in C major that you have at a certain point, you have a C on beat 3 and 4. Instead of just giving that C on the third beat immediately with a consonant chord of C major, obviously in the right hand, the first reaction of the Partimento player would be to add a dissonance on the third beat and play the normal chord, the actual consonant chord on the fourth beat. And there he has 3 options to do that. First option is to replace the third with the fourth. Option 2 is to replace the doubling of the fundamental note, so the doubling of the bass, doubling of the C, with the ninth. And obviously the combination of both gives the third possibility. So in that case, you get a 9-4, 8-3 texture or dissonance. When you have a sixth chord, you have lesser possibilities. Actually, there is basically only one. It means that you will replace the sixth by the seventh. So this is in a very short explanation of how dissonance adds actually musical interest within Partimento thinking.
You've been teaching Partimento. You have a lot of experience teaching it. What are some common mistakes or common challenges you find practically for your students learning this material? Where are the things that really slow them down?
It's changing the basic realization into musical realization. Playing the chords is fairly simple because, when you know the rule of the octave well, when you know the exceptions to the rule of the octave well, when you know your cadences, then playing a Partimento, a simple Partimento by Fenaroli, is not so hard because they are really the application of what has been learned in an abstract way. Taking it one step further, so this implies changing this texture, this multi-voiced texture, into the typical idiomatic keyboard texture. That means a three-voiced texture, which is hard for the student. Playing full chords without any voice leading, this goes fairly quickly. Changing this texture into a beautiful three-part texture with two upper voices, let's say as if you would compose a piece for two violins and basso continuo, this is where it gets, for a lot of students, I would say a little difficult.
What's the solution?
The solution is that they have to know certain basic principles. First principle is that Fenaroli wants his students to learn textures. When you look at the end, for instance, of his second Partimento, you already see this concern for introduction of textures. Why would he introduce in a Partimento consisting only of half notes and quarter notes, only at the end 4 8 notes? Obviously, because this introduces a new texture. A texture which introduces a texture in 3 voices. This is the typical texture with one laying voice and one voice which will move in parallel thirds. When you look at the next Partimento in A major, this is exactly what Fenaroli wants his students to do. So the step from Partimento 2 to Partimento 3 is quite difficult because the second one is fairly easy. Apart from perhaps the ending, where the level of realization is augmented, the quality is augmented with that new texture. And that new texture, 3-part texture, parallel thirds, laying note, is fully exploited within the reminder, actually, of the first book, but already within the A major Partimento, which is a fantastic illustration of that. In the first half of that bar, for instance, you could put the parallel thirds in the upper voice, the laying note in the middle voice. Second half of that bar, you will do exactly the opposite. The laying note will be in the upper voice, the parallel thirds will be in the inner voice. This is so important for the student that they can learn this gradually, that they take their time to absorb all the different textures which are implied within those partimento, to become fully acquainted with keyboard improvisation, with keyboard composition, because this is one of the major purposes of partimento playing, of this education. It should not sound as an exercise. It should sound as quickly as possible as a composition, as the improvisation of a composition. And when you play just the basic chords, obviously this will not sound as a composition, this will sound as an exercise. This is the difficult step to make, but the absolutely necessary step to make.
Can you comment on books 2, 4, and 5? What somebody could expect and your insights into these other books that Fenaroli has?
Book 2 is let's say is of another level. In book 1, everything is fairly short and is an illustration of, I would say, the basic rules. When he goes to the second book, what he does there is a full-blown training of dissonances. So already when you look at the first one, when I give the first one to a student, he or she panics because of the sheer amount of figures, but also by its size and by the different tonalities, even G minor within G major, etc. So there you see that Fenaroli takes it to, brusquely, I would say, to really another level. And it goes on. Every partimento is really challenging and a real illustration, a real application of dissonances, both dissonances in the bass, and dissonances implied or explicit within the realization of the right hand. And as always, Fenaroli anticipates what will come later. So this means that in the second book, you will see already moti del basso appear. I think, for instance, of the B minor one, which is a beautiful chromatically descending bass in the beginning, where he anticipates what will be seen later as a full-blown moto del basso. And again, in the second book, he still respects the same order of keys like he did in the first book. So he starts on G and he works his way up to the keys, so G, A, B, D, etc. And then that's the second book, really a very hard training on the dissonances. And then when we go to the next book, you speak of fourth book, I speak of third book, because this would lead me a little bit too far now, but I don't believe, I've written an article on that recently in 18th century music, I don't believe that the organization of the first edition of the complete corpus by Fenaroli, the complete Partimento corpus by Fenaroli, is what reflects Fenaroli as a teacher.
You mentioned actually that, was it in Bimbo? They kind of messed it up, or they kind of put it in the wrong order.
Yeah, so it would be too complex now to get into that, but indeed he mixed up, I believe, some series of partimenti. As I've tried to explain, Fenaroli really explains things, cadences, rule of the octave, and then, as an application, he gives a series of partimenti. Then he explains dissonances. To applicate that, he gives a series of partimenti. And then, afterwards, he explains the moti del basso, on which he gives a long series of partimenti. And in Bimbo, he changes and he gives very simple partimenti after more complex partimenti. So you see that the logical increase of difficulty is not there anymore. So he gets, like you say, mixed up. And actually what in Bimbo calls book 3 is only the it's a big book, but still is the explanation of the moti del basso. but it does not contain the actual partimenti on the moto del basso. For him, this is book 4. Not only, but basically it's book 4. So this does not make sense. So what you say is book 4 is for me book 3. And actually all the manuscripts that I saw, nearly all the manuscripts that I saw, confirm that. And one could say that book 1, book 2, and book 3 of Fenaroli consisted his basic Partimento course. And then what in Bimbo calls book 5, which are the more complex preludes, fugues, so the more contrapuntal pieces, this is actually the more advanced Partimento course, one could say. And actually, for in Bimbo's, Fenaroli was to a certain extent implicated, apparently within the edition, but complained because he wrote to a student of him, Marco Santucci, that in Bimbo was preparing his edition, but it was full with errors, and so obviously a little bit pitiful. But for that edition, especially for that edition, Fenaroli wrote to Santucci that he composed a 5th book of Partimenti. Not the 6th book as they are published in Bimbo, but the 5th book of the most complex fugal Partimento you will ever find. So this is somewhat the bigger picture of Fenaroli Partimenti, and one should not forget that the most complex Partimenti by Fenaroli, so the last book, what Fenaroli himself called the 5th book, were actually composed only at the very, very, very end of his life, from 1811 probably, and he died in 1818. So that book had hardly any, if at all, importance, I would say, within the musical training of Fenaroli.
Can you talk a little bit about your work on Tonal Tools, which is a very interesting project, a book that was released and seemed to make Partimento and schema theory very accessible and relatable to even contemporary music?
When I approach improvisation, I do it via the 2 different approaches, I would say. I would say the Sanguinetti approach and the Gjerdingen approach. So at the one hand, there is the training, the Partimento training leading up to even fugal improvisation. So along that path, students have to improvise their own Partimenti. So this means they choose a moto del basso. They make a structure. Let's say they start in A minor. They will make a modulation. They go to C major. They will make a modulation. They go to D major, they make a modulation, and they come back to A minor. A very small form, but a form which is very, very important within 18th century thinking. And gradually, this can become elaborated, this can become bigger and bigger. So this is the first way of getting to improvisation. The other way of getting into improvisation is starting by, let's say, by a genre which was so important within the 18th century to train composers, the genre of minuet. So this means that a minuet is a very simple genre in the sense that a student can oversee the full structure of this little piece. You start, for instance, in C major, you have 8 bars in the first half, you have to arrive in the middle of the bar in G major. Then in your second half, again, you have 8 bars. You will have, let's say, an excursion, so to speak, from bar 9 to 12. And then at the very end, you will come back to C major. And so in that other way to get to improvisation, I really start from Mr. Gjerdingen's book, starting with Romanesca, starting with Prinner, starting with Fonte. And it is amazing that even with small children, you get very quickly into real life improvisation, even when they know only those 3 building blocks of composition, of improvisation. And gradually, you can introduce new patterns. For instance, you could replace the Romanesca at the beginning, which normally is followed by a little printer. You could replace it with a 4-bar do, re, mi. You could decide on replacing the fonte after the double bar line in the middle of the piece by a monte, for instance. You could elaborate your structure. You could tell the student, can you please play both a fonte and a monte after the double bar line? And could you make, instead of a printer of 4 bars, could you play 2 consecutive printers? One, I would say, standard one, and then, for instance, one more elaborated with a circle of fifths, so to speak. And from there, I get to sonata improvisation. Students who know well the improvisation of minuet, from there on, the step to a small sonata form is not so easy. It's not so difficult anymore, because they have the same tonal path, so to speak. We just have to elaborate form. And before you know, a student plays, and I had a fantastic student, he improvised a full-blown sonata with 3 movements in the style of early Beethoven, for instance. Gradually, you make it bigger. You give more input, you give more possibilities, you give more textures, etc.
I guess to end off, what projects do you have lined up for 2020? Do you have any events you want to plug? Any articles you're publishing? What's happening in 2020?
I think the most important thing I'm very, very excited about it. I am planning a text-critical, complete edition of Fenaroli's Partimenti, because research has shown that this is really necessary. And it's also quite astonishing that one of the most important, if not the most important Partimento maestro ever has not been honored, I would say, with the critical edition of his fantastic Partimento corpus. So I'm working hard on that. And I hope that, it gets really concrete within 2020. If not, it will be at latest 2021. So this is perhaps, within this area is the most important thing which is going on for the moment, I would say.
Fantastic. And I actually have a really silly quick question to ask you. I was wondering, you're such a master of 18th century and earlier and improvising and classical improvisation. Do you have a secret pop side or jazz side that you listen to? I'm just kind of curious if you listen to other styles of music. I'm just wondering.
I'm addicted to Richard Strauss, and I'm addicted to Richard Wagner. Those 2 composers, and I don't want to explain why, because why does music touch? That is, you cannot explain it. But if I listen to the Alpine Symphony of Richard Strauss, or if I listen to the Ring, this gets under my skin, and I don't know why. And if I want to listen to something, this type of music will be my first choice.
Wonderful. Okay, actually, I do have the final question, and it is this. If you could reform music education for young children from maybe 5 to before undergraduate, how would you reform music education? And that's the final question.
Whoa, that's a very hard one. I would say that, and I had the pleasure already of experimenting a little bit with that, I would suggest to stop avoiding separating courses. When a child goes to his piano course, that child is also informed really in music, that he learns or she learns right from the beginning to speak the language instead of just playing the notes, that the teacher tries to get creative with a certain repertoire. Obviously, when you are dealing with 18th century music, this is more obvious than when playing Chopin and Brahms, etc. But still, so the connection between what today we call theory at the one hand and practice at the other hand, that we start to get rid of that wall in between them. This would be this would be the starting point of trying to reform music education from 5 years on. But this implies obviously a huge investment of the teachers also. And this I have been lucky to have been asked on several I would say training courses for teachers to try to very modestly try to show them possibilities, because I don't want to impose. I don't want to say I have the truth. That is absolutely not the case. But I just want to show that the dry way of approaching instrumental lesson, which is the danger, I feel, that you can make it wet, so to speak, with that creative side, with the side of understanding what is happening. Perhaps playing another note when you play a repeat. Perhaps adding an ornament. Perhaps adding a trill. Perhaps changing 2 8 notes into 4 16 notes. So this kind of hands-on approach, instead of putting the score on a pedestal, so making it holy, so to speak.
Wonderful. Well, Professor Ewald Demeyere, thank you so much for coming on the show. I mean, it could have kept going, right? I mean, it's so much fun to talk about this, and I think everyone is so excited about Partimento, and it's really, I think a lot of people are getting turned on to it. They're getting so excited by it. It's getting a wider appreciation, and your work is really stellar. And I really hope people check out your music, because you've really recorded some great music, some great CDs, and they check out your website. And I hope to be able to talk to you again really soon. So, Ewald, thank you so much. Have a great rest of the day.
Thank you. It was a pleasure.